This is I Hear Things for May 28th, 2021, the Celebrity Podcast, Neither Fish Nor Fowl. So The Guardian ran a piece this week about celebrity podcasts and whether or not they were going to ruin podcasting. And I don't think they're going to ruin podcasting. Here's what I do think. In the short term, they might be good for podcasting. They'll potentially attract some new earballs to the space, right? But have a think about how those earballs are going to find these new podcasts. If they are exclusive, say to Spotify, for example, then the answer is pretty straightforward. You'll find them on Spotify. But for many new listeners, they're going to completely circumvent the usual channels of Apple Podcasts and other kind of dedicated podcatching software. They're going to find out about these new shows on celebrities' Twitter feeds or Instagram feeds or stumble across them on YouTube. And they're going to listen to them on demand wherever they encounter them. So they're not necessarily, I think, going to bring people to a podcasting platform. I think people are going to trip over a lot of this content and kind of consume it in the wild. And if you listened to the show last week, you know this is already happening, right? When I talked a little bit about the percentage of podcast listeners who were choosing to listen to podcasts on platforms like YouTube. It's already happening. So I'm not necessarily sure that the potential new influx of listeners to these celebrity-driven shows is necessarily going to result in a new audience for podcasting per se. But will they actually do harm, as the title of the Guardian piece suggests? No, I don't think they're going to do harm. Most of them, I submit, aren't going to last that long. They may make a splash. They may briefly take some of the oxygen out of the podcasting room, and I know discovery is hard enough already. But celebrity is not a guarantee of success, and the lack of celebrity is not a death knell. In Edison's podcast consumer tracker, we rank the relative reach of the biggest shows in the space, and we measure that by the percentage of the available podcast listening audience who listened to that show in the last week. So may I present to you the 5 biggest celebrities in podcasting. Number 1, and by a lot, Joe Rogan. Number 2, that household name, Michael Barbaro. Number 3, the duo of Ashley Flowers and Brit Prawat. Number 4, Ira Glass. And number 5, Chuck Bryant and Josh Clark. And by the way, for comparison, the 5 highest paid actors from the last year, according to Forbes anyway, are number 1, Dwayne Johnson, Ryan Reynolds, Mark Wahlberg, Scarlett Johansson, and Ben Affleck. A couple of things about these lists. First of all, there's a lot of dudes. Also, ScarJo was able to bump Vin Diesel out of the top 5. But since we are, I think, doomed to get Fast and Furious 23 skidoo later this year, I think that will be short-lived. But the podcast list is fascinating, right? Clearly, you don't have to be a celebrity to be podcast famous. Joe Rogan is the undisputed number 1 show in podcasting. And yes, he is a celebrity, but he's not exactly Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, is he? Joe Rogan is not going to carry your movie. What he does have is a strong viewpoint, a sharply defined audience, and some skill behind the mic. Ira Glass is public radio famous, but he could probably stand in the express line of my Stop and Shop and not be molested, I think. And then you have Ashley Flowers and Chuck Bryant, and I think I've made my point here. Celebrity is not a requirement for success. But more importantly, being famous doesn't make you a better podcaster. What makes you a better podcaster is patience, reps, and commitment to your craft. Let's take a walk, shall we, through the garden of forgotten celebrity talk shows. And in that garden, we find shows like Alf, the puppet alien, had a talk show. Magic Johnson had a show called The Magic Hour. Pat Sajak, who at least was successful on a game show, had a very unsuccessful talk show. And Alan Thicke, Canadian television star, I think you probably may have seen him in some sitcoms, also had a show, not great. And of course, the all-timer, tennis player John McEnroe. And I've posted a clip, and there's a link in the show notes to some of the worst moments from the John McEnroe show. And I'm not going to lie, it's low-key legendary. Podcasting is hard. Hosting a show is hard, and growing a show is very hard. And it calls for a skill set that I think very few people have, celebrity or not. Because of that, I actually find the recent rash of celebrity-driven podcast announcements more curious than anything else. In business school, I learned that there's one classic dilemma that drives almost every internal and external decision that you make as a company. Build versus buy. Do I build my own sales management solution, or do I pony up for Salesforce? Do I try to build Facebook but for Gen Z, or do I just buy Instagram? Do I attempt to fry my own chicken at home, or do I just call Popeyes? There's a correct answer to all three of those. In podcasting, we have also seen a number of notable examples of the build versus buy paradigm. When Amazon was making decisions about an audio strategy, they certainly had the money to build their own homegrown podcast studio, and the time and the patience. They've certainly done it in any number of other areas. But they opted to buy Wondery. Wondery, by the way, a company with a demonstrated, repeatable skill set in a very difficult discipline. And long before that, they bought Audible. And you might naturally assume that buying costs more than building. But honestly, I'm not sure you can say that in podcasting. Not yet. I don't think the industry is mature enough to be able to make that kind of a blanket statement. It's still growing too fast. Look at it this way. iHeartMedia has been building its own podcast for years, but it was buying How Stuff Works that really gave them the jumpstart into the top tier of podcast networks. And they bought Stuff Media for $55 million. And honestly, that looks pretty good right now. These two choices in their purest form come down to this. Do I pay a lot now to acquire a thing fully formed, or do I pay over time to try and build a thing myself? The premium that you pay, at least at the time, for a buy decision is a premium to reduce risk. And that's what makes the current spate of celebrity podcast announcements a curiosity of sorts to me. These deals represent neither building nor buying. They incorporate the risk and the time horizon of the build with the upfront cost of the buy. They are build and buy decisions. And that's what makes this new untested celebrity podcast neither fish nor fowl. They're the intersection of the biggest risks of both building and buying. When Spotify paid Amy Schumer to do a show, this was a buy and build decision. And I don't know if it's paid off or not. But when they signed an exclusive deal with Dax Shepard, the risk of the build was removed. They were buying a straight-up success. That's a podcast that's generally in our top 20 by reach. And it's a show that, like Joe Rogan's show, it might be hosted by a celebrity, but let's be honest, Dax Shepard is not exactly a household name. More people probably know him as Kristen Bell's husband than as the writer-director star of Chips. What he is, though, thanks to that writer-director sensibility, is a fantastic podcaster. When Spotify licensed his show, they bought a thing well made. So yes, we're going to have a glut of celebrity podcasts for a while, but I think a bunch of them are not going to return their investment, and the balance of the force will be restored. For the average podcaster, I think the challenge is twofold: outlast and outperform. Now, the first part of that is just perseverance. But the second part requires a growth mindset. That's a thing I've talked about on this show before. The only way in the long term that a new celebrity podcast is going to take audience from your podcast is if your podcast is not as good. Take the celebrity out of the equation completely for a second, because again, they're not a guarantee of success. If your show right now is not as good mechanically and formatically as a new celebrity podcast, then you can't really carp about them stealing your audience. If your show doesn't surprise and delight as much as a new celebrity show, then you can't claim that their show is ruining podcasting or making discovery harder. Ultimately, I think celebrity offers a short-term boost, but not a long-term advantage. Commitment to craft and excellence is a long-term advantage. If your interview show isn't honestly better than the John McEnroe show, you can't claim his celebrity is why you can't find listeners. And if it is, just be patient. Keep getting better. Learn from successes and learn from mistakes, not just yours, but learn from others. Learn from McEnroe and Magic and Schumer and Obama and Springsteen. Learn from all of them. Your time is going to come. Be back next week with a corker of a show, part 2 of my What Do Listeners Want series that I had on my newsletter last year. And some big news also for podcasters, large and small. So if you appreciate what I'm doing here, I hope you will subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the newsletter at tomwebster.media. Links are in the show notes. And you can even buy me a coffee if you'd like. That link is there as well. Until next week, I'm Tom Webster, and this is I Hear Things.